Welcome to today's webinar, a conversation about economic recovery in turbulent times. My name is Andrew Cardozo. I'm president of the Pearson Center, and I want to welcome you here this afternoon. I want to start by recognizing that the Pearson Center is headquartered on the unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe peoples, and we welcome our speakers and audience from across Turtle Island. As you may know, the Pearson Center was established in 2013. We're a progressive think tank that addresses ideas with a range of people. We make sure we bring together people from all political parties, business, labor, civil society groups, and other experts to talk about the economic and social issues of the day. We like to say that we bring people and ideas together. A special thank you to all our donors and sponsors who make this kind of event possible. I want to especially mention three sustaining sponsors who are AMAPCO, Ontario's professional employees, the International Association of Firefighters, and Canada's Building Trades Unions. If you like this kind of event, please feel free to visit our website at thepearsoncentre.ca and make a donation of your own so that there could be more of these kind of events in these exceptional times of change. Just briefly on the format, there will be a moderated discussion with the panel for about 40 minutes, and then we will take questions from you, the audience. So make sure you send in your questions in the question box, and we'll get to as many questions as we can. The session will end at 5 p.m. Eastern Time. So, economic recovery in turbulent times. When we designed this session, the world was not quite as turbulent as it is today with the events in Ukraine. And just on the matter of Ukraine, I want to let you know that we will host another session on the topic of what's happening in Europe, a webinar with former Foreign Affairs Minister Lloyd Axworthy, and that's going to take place on Thursday at 12 noon Eastern Time. So today we are very fortunate to have gathered some of Canada's top business, labor, and government leaders to talk about the economic recovery for Canada at large with regards to COVID and the general economic turbulence that we have seen in the past 2 years. Being Black History Month, or some people prefer to call it Black Futures Month, we will also focus on economic equality and advancement of Black Canadians. We have a very accomplished panel. I will keep my introduction to them very brief because we want to hear from them. Norma Domey is the National Vice President of the Professional Institute of the Public Service of Canada. She is also an advisory board member of the Centre for Expertise in Mental Health at the Federal Public Service Workplace. Jaqi Parchment is Chief Executive Officer of Mercer Canada. She's also a board member of Black North Initiative and the Business Council of Canada. Howard Shearer is Chief Executive Canada Hitachi and is chair of the board of the Energy Council of Canada. Our moderator today, back at the Pearson podium by popular demand, the influential Greg Fergus, Member of Parliament for Hull-Aylmer. He is Parliamentary Secretary to both the Prime Minister and the President of the Treasury Board, and he is chair of the Black Caucus. With that, over to you, Greg Fergus.
Well, thank you very much, Andrew. And you know, we don't want to be held up for misleading advertising here. So I'm only as influential as people will allow me to be. So I'm really glad that the Black community has been very stepping up to the plate and really talking about issues of importance, which is what we're doing here today. To really be talking about economic recovery, what it looks like, and how do we plan ahead for that in these disturbing and certainly disturbing times. We have an amazing panel. As you had introduced between Jaqi, Howard, and Norma, I think we're going to be able to really cover a lot of issues and have a lot of great insights. So without further ado, let's get right into it. So I'd like to start off with, when we do talk about economic recovery, often the first thing we think of course, is the private sector. And so I'd like to have this question perhaps for Jaqi and to Howard. I'm wondering, by way of introduction of yourselves and your organization, can you explain what your business does?
Well, I can start.
Right on.
Thank you so much, Greg. And again, thank you for your service to Canada. It's so deeply appreciated, and especially for our community. So Mercer Canada is Canada's preeminent human resource consulting firm. We do everything that you could possibly think of in terms of helping employers attract and retain workers and keep them whole and healthy and financially well, except we don't actually recruit. So HR strategy around return to work, diversity, digitization of HR, wellness, both physical and mental, and pension plans and other forms of financial security.
Before I go to Howard, Jaqi, I was wondering if you could explore that a little bit more in terms of, has things changed since the summer of 2020 in terms of people looking to retain, hire, and promote Canadians of diverse backgrounds, and in particular Black Canadians?
I'm happy to say yes. I think we're seeing much more awareness, both as we've seen the impact of COVID and post George Floyd, of the need to have a more equitable society. Important to know that going into COVID, Canada was already facing an issue, a structural issue, in terms of having, enough people and the right people with the right skills to move us forward in terms of growing our economy. For a little while, it was a bit uncertain as to what COVID would do and uncertainty around hiring. But boy, that structural issue, that structural labor issue that we saw going into COVID, the Band-Aid's been ripped off. And so in general, I think all employers are concerned about talent. What I'm loving is that we are seeing now that, from an economic perspective, forget from the right thing to do perspective, but from an economic perspective, we cannot afford to leave anyone behind, including Black Canadians.
Right on. Howard, if you could, by way of introduction, explain what you do, and specifically, how do you see the world from the economic standpoint from Hitachi or from your work with the Energy Council of Canada?
Thank you, and certainly it's an honor to be here. So, just for background, Hitachi is approximately 111 years old. I've been with Hitachi for 37 years, going into 38 years. We are an global organization of approximately $80 billion US. We have roughly about 387,000 employees worldwide, and approximately, I would say, maybe 875 companies. In Canada, we have 17 business units. We operate under the umbrella of approximately 11 sectors or modalities. Mobility for one, for example, healthcare, data, certainly industrial manufacturing. We have a truck manufacturing facility in Guelph, for example. And so we like to think that we touch every aspect of Canadian life and make a very valuable contribution. In terms of, we have approximately maybe 1,400 employees in Canada as a point of reference, and we are constantly looking for talent and trying to remain competitive. Now, in terms of looking back at the past 2 years, the world has changed. We compete globally. We compete globally with certainly very capable organizations. And also we in Canada compete globally for resources too within our own organization. So I would say that the pandemic has enabled us to re-vector, pivot, look carefully of not what we achieved before, but what we must achieve tomorrow. And there's dramatic change, as you know, in business models, and we could get into that more, but that's the sort of the overview of where Hitachi's at and obviously where we're going as we pivot from a straight manufacturing company to a solutions-driven company with innovation and digitization to be certainly at the forefront of our strategy. Thank you.
I'm going to be coming back to you on some of those points, Howard, in a second. But when we obviously talk about the private sector, we also talk about there's no work without workers. One of the most important parts of that is the ability for collective bargaining to accomplish many things, not the least of which is changing or encouraging better working conditions. Norma Domey, you are the vice president of one of Canada's largest public sector unions, over at PIPS. And I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about how you see what your union does, and who do you represent, if you could explain that to a lot of the folks there who are from outside of the National Capital Region.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the opportunity. The Professional Institute of the Public Service of Canada, which we basically abbreviate to PIPS, is actually 100 years old. We actually celebrated our 100-year anniversary last year. And we represent about 60,000 members. And we are also Canada's largest union representing scientists. So we cover the whole gamut. We also represent some provincial and some territorial governments as well. In a nutshell, the Institute was founded to protect the interests of professional public employees whose mandate is essentially to serve Canadians. So from providing serve in 9 weeks, mind you, an enormous feat. So when government needs to work fast, we can work fast. To approving vaccines are at Health Canada, to doing research in our Winnipeg biolabs on vaccines, providing PPE, etc. over COVID, to our nurses working in remote parts of Canada, just to name a few. We cover the whole gamut, along with CRA, our auditors, and it's huge, our portfolios, when you think about them. So I'll leave it there, because I've got a lot to say and I don't want to take time.
Howard, I'm just going to ask you just to lower the boom mic just a little bit more. Perfect. It's just catching the breathing from you. Please, Norma, you mentioned how you're the Professional Institute of the Public Service of Canada. You in particular, or your membership in particular, played a very, very strong role, as you mentioned, during the Canada Emergency Response Benefit, or approval of vaccines at a level, at a rapidity that we have not seen outside of truly a national crisis like wartime. Can you talk a little bit about how you felt the public service played this role during COVID? How was it, in 2021 to making sure that we were delivering programs and being present to Canadians as well as to businesses?
Well, I think the results speak for themselves. When COVID hit, Canadians across Canada realized what the public service actually does for them. From supply chain issues, our veterinarians came into play, to our frontline workers, nurses working remotely, to folks actively ramping up for COVID and the vaccine approvals, as you mentioned. And, the laboratories, not just at Tunney's Pasture, but out in Winnipeg, who are world renowned, working on PPEs, working on developing a vaccine. It was a huge, huge effort. But, you know, from what we do and the gains back to Canadians, it also highlighted the gaps, I guess I would say. For instance, in 2020, our Women in Science team conducted a survey worldwide. And, you know, the parental and family leave in the federal public service was shone a lens on. And, you know, we found it was a broken system. And one that runs on, you know, managerial decisions that were ad hoc, depending on which department or which agency you worked for. Employees dealing with impossible decisions, disproportionate penalties to women and gender diverse people. So it's, I won't talk too much about that, but you know, the survey brought out a lot of information. And I would just say that, you know, folks have to realize that the public service does long-term research, which, you know, our universities and academia and our private institutions don't necessarily do. And we really need, going forward, our piece of the pie for funding as far as research is concerned. So it brought out a lot of issues, but it also highlighted the value that we bring to Canadians. And I'm hoping, besides just CRA being associated with taxes, they developed the CERB, you know, which was
which was a lifeline for over 9 million Canadians.
Lifeline for folks across the country. So you know, there's a lot of work that the public service does that, you know, I'm hoping that in this recovery, we're not made the scapegoats, because oftentimes they say public service, okay, austerity needs to happen. And
well,
we're the
let's hold on that, because I think you're raising a good point about recovery. And and I'd like to hear from Jaqi, how has your business been affected by COVID over the last 2 years, you know, as a health issue? And then what do you think it is doing now as a recovery begins? And what do you see as a way along?
Yeah, so it's a great question. So, you know, like many business at the start of COVID, we just didn't know. So we're in the people business. Initially, it was unclear as to what was going to happen with the economy. So many of our clients retrenched. And so part of our revenue comes from consulting, which tends to be quite discretionary. Part of our revenue comes from digital solutions that was more sustainable. So at the start it was scary, but we made a commitment that we were going to keep employment whole and that we were going to keep our people safe. And our perspective was that if we could keep our people physically and mentally well, and keep our clients informed as to what was happening in terms of mental wellness and physical wellness, because that's a big part of what we do, that good things would happen. And so, you know, 2020 was uncertain, but boy, 2021, when employment came roaring back, where the structural issues around talent and having the right workforce came back to the fore, we were incredibly well positioned. We had our people well, you know, ready to go. And so being in an environment where talent, where the changing nature of work, as Howard mentioned, where the need to be able to pivot and have a flexible workforce that, you know, is skills-based rather than just job-based, all of that is really, really good for our business.
So in a sense, you sort of have some of the, I guess it's looking very rosy going forward in terms of this changing environment and what that would represent for your sector in the private sector, which in a bit is a bit of the opposite concern that Norma was raising at the end of her comments. Howard, I'm wondering for you, from you're not in a personnel business, but yet you have you have so many different business lines that are associated with your company. How are you seeing in terms of how COVID affected your business over the last 2 years, and what is that road to recovery for you?
I think it is from a Jaqi perspective, we had to be very strategic. We had to look at the changes that are taking place within the environment, and also set out to acquire the talent that we don't have, and to position ourselves to compete globally. So, for example, we made strategic acquisitions. You cannot enter a new market. You have no time to deliver it and build organically. And so, as the world pivoted to, for example, an e-commerce platform, as they pivoted to a data environment, a digital world, we made strategic investments, for example, in I'd say startups. We not only in Canada over the years, but also globally. And so gave ourselves the bench strength, so that we could be very competitive going forward. And also we leverage.
I'm just going to ask you just to, opposite of before, just lift up your microphone just a little higher maybe just around by your bottom lip there. That would be great.
Okay, fine. Is that better?
Great. Yeah, that's much better.
Right. So we developed our bench strength so that we could compete in the digital world. It's very simple.
Mm-hmm.
We went into critical infrastructure. We've always been a critical infrastructure type company. And so, for example, if you look at the trend, for example, in electrification, what is more important than the grid? And in order to have a proper ESG and SDG strategy, environmental sustainable goals, governance, right. I should say. And so we certainly doubled down on that. We made acquisitions again for example, we acquired ABB Power Grid business, which is now Hitachi Energy. And as you can well imagine, as we, for example, as Canada moves to electrification in terms of decarbonization, effective grid also with renewables becomes so very important. So again, Hitachi has positioned itself there. So we try to leverage what we know and try to discover what we don't know, for example, and then assemble the talent globally, wherever it comes from, to be able to achieve the goals that suit our corporate objectives and, of course, benefit society. So it moves, for example, from society 4.0 to society 5.0, which is utilizing, the certainly the social innovation aspect to increase a better value proposition for people's lives. Just pause here.
So Howard raises a point, and Jaqi, you pointed out too, in terms of the digital world has changed now for employment. Jaqi, I was wondering, have you found, in preparing for a post-COVID environment, are you also being able to recruit people or to be able to have people, supporting them because of the digital tools that we all have available to us now? Is remote work, is this now a sine qua non of the workforce?
Yeah, so we have about 1,100 employees across Canada. Like every employer, digital skill is hugely important. Sometimes that skill is found in Canada, sometimes that's found in other countries. Sometimes our Canadian workers are supporting Mercer's operations and Mercer's innovation globally around the rest of the world. So yeah, I mean, we've always had an environment where, the best work together. I think COVID, made it more normal that we would have this cross-border collaboration. We've had to, like all employers, decide what our talent of the future strategy will be. We think of flexibility, Greg, in a number of different ways. Certainly where our people are located and where they work is part of that. But it's also options around when they work, what kind of work they do, job sharing, the ability to transition to different roles using their skills. And all of that is really important for us, and I think any other employer, in terms of attracting and retaining the workforce of the future.
Norma, you talked about how much the public service had made on a dime transferred to working remotely and coming up with those really important programs which came to the aid of so many individuals and businesses and organizations across the country. How do you see the digital world changing? How does that affect your membership? How does that affect their working conditions? What do you expect going forward as we move out of the pandemic and into this brave new digital world?
Well, it was interesting. It was interesting to see the progression over the last 2 years. Many of our members are comfortable working from home. They are set up. Some of us were already working from home a couple of days a week, but many were not. And, it resulted in issues which we needed to address, from ergonomics to, getting the right setup in their home office. And then there were people, obviously, who are not comfortable with working at home because either they've got childcare issues, or believe it or not, it's not a safe place for them to work from home. And I see that our work will be really different. We will probably take a hybrid approach, whereby we will be coming into the office a couple of days a week and working from home, the remainder of the time. I think really what this has done is allowed for better work-life balance, better flexibility, and it's a new way of working. Obviously, if you've got, like I had when I was in the public service, I've put in 3 decades at Health Canada and Environment and Climate Change Canada, more the latter. And I was working on confidential files. So depending on your work situation, obviously I wouldn't be able to work from home unless I had arrangements that would protect the confidentiality. Also, our labs. There is a lab, those labs have to operate 24/7. We have had
you can't set up in your garage at home.
No, there's research you're doing that has to be monitored, but that being said, there's a lot of disadvantages. Our researchers who do a lot of field work, their funding was affected. Their work in the field, they do a lot of international collaboration, that was affected. So it has domestic reaches, and it also has global reaches as far as our members are concerned. So I think we've adapted quite nicely and addressed the issues that we needed to address, and worked with our EROs where there were issues, and addressed them as soon as possible, so that our employees, the public servants, could be comfortable. And there's some challenges still in that whole scenario, because we've got everything from dealing with folks that were working too many hours at home because You know, some of the schools were closed, and you know, those issues had to be addressed because it sort of has a domino effect on mental health. So, you know, we've pivoted nicely. We've addressed the challenges, and some of those challenges we weren't able to satisfy, but we're working hard on behalf of our members across Canada to improve.
Okay. All right. So then, Howard and Norma, we've reached this point. You know, over 100% of the jobs that had been lost due to the pandemic have now been recovered, but it's a different combination of people who are working. So, what do you think, Howard? Let's start with you. What do governments need to do to help this recovery along? Even though, in terms of just jobs, we might be there, but there's still many elements and perhaps many people who still need some help along in some companies. What does government need to do to create that right environment going forward?
So yeah, I believe if we separate small business and larger entities, I think it's good to start. And I think if you refer to the recent report by RBC, for example, indicated for a small business point of view, even though the jobs are recovered, their debt position is still fairly high. And that's debt incurred, for example, reaching out and accessing government support. And so right off the bat, there is room, obviously, for government to be able to maybe extend some relief to small business, maybe a longer time to address the repayment. That's one aspect. The other aspect is that the business model has changed, right? So digitalization has leveled the playing field. That means, you know, you may be local here, but you certainly have competition from Amazon from anywhere in the world for 24-hour delivery, as a matter of fact. So I think businesses in general, not only small business, but let's talk with small business for a moment, will need definitely help to accommodate the transition to a digital economy. That will take, I think, support in many ways. That's very important. The other aspect is to the ability to supply chain that impacts large and small companies, and definitely in trying to obtain material, also that's very important, and also access to market. The government can play a significant role in having the type of trade deals that, for example, allow, for example, our businesses, whether small or large, to have access to markets. This is very important because ultimately we need to be able to expand our trade beyond our borders, actually beyond our provincial borders, much less our international borders. So these are just a few things that I see that government can do very effectively, and also certainty in policy. Policy is very important, particularly how do we take the opacity out of business, the difficulty, the regulations? How do we minimize and enable business to flourish in an environment? And then last but not least, I think government needs to be able to invest in critical infrastructure that grows the economy, right? So for example, broadband, which is so important. Broadband impacts, for example, healthcare, education, and financial. So these are the areas, I think, just some of the areas. And I will pause, but obviously there's so much more that we could come back to it.
Norma, briefly, what do you think governments need to do? And you have a privileged view from working inside the machinery of government. What do you think governments need to do to help a recovery along, given where we are now? Oops, Norma, I'm afraid you're on mute.
That's a huge question. But I'll start by saying that we're welcoming the Canadian Net Zero Emissions Accountability Act, which received royal assent and became law in June. You know, since we are science-based, you know, that's very important to us. The new law basically enshrines a commitment to reach net zero emissions by 2050.
Right.
It's, you know, now we must hold the government accountable for meeting the milestones set, and we have to stay on track, which we don't have a history of doing. So we need to deliver on stronger and more comprehensive public health care. We need permanent improvements in EI because, you know, EI was put on hold while we had the CERB, but then there was two classes of citizens, some who didn't qualify for CERB, some who didn't qualify for EI. So we need help there, maybe putting CERB under the umbrella of EI, bringing back EI. So that's a whole different conversation that needs to be held. We need help for families that are struggling with rising prices. We need action on fighting climate change. For instance, I put in a briefing note to our board to divest in fossil fuels with respect to our pension plans last year. And we need legislation and investments in public transit, clean energy, green manufacturing. You know, there's a lot going on, a lot to address, and you know, I'll leave it there.
Okay. Well then, so that would be what governments need to do. And thank you, Howard. Thank you, Norma, for that. Maybe Jaqi and Howard, I'd like to know, what do you think the private sector, what does the private sector have to do to help the recovery along?
So I can start. I can kick that off, Greg. So I could say 100 things, but because I'm in the tile business, I won't. Let's talk about people. Okay. You know, this recovery is going to be about sustainable transformation. Sustainable transformation. So everyone is worried about talent and having enough and the right talent to move Canada forward. And, you know, I think as a private sector, we need to continue to think about more than just, you know, who is moving between companies. It's who is leaving the workforce because we're not doing what we need to do to support them, and who is there that's really talented that isn't in the workforce. So if I talk about stopping the brain drain that's leaving the workforce, you know, women who may be burnt out, childcare. I'm personally a huge advocate of the daycare program that's that the federal government is bringing in. I think that's going to be transformational for generations of women, especially. But you know, for employers to think about whose needs are not being met, and if they were to do things a little bit differently, create jobs a bit differently, support better with mental health, support better with removing stress, could we keep valuable resources working on our economy for the future? And then in terms of who's excluded, we know the obvious candidates. So moving forward with making sure that underrepresented groups, you know, are treated equally, given equal access, and immigrants, because we're in such a unique position. We bring in, what, 400,000 immigrants a year? There's really no argument about that, right? That's an amazing and beautiful thing. But do we use their talents in the way that we should use their talents? So I'm proud to sit on the board of the Business Council of Canada. I will say that the CEOs on the council talk about these issues a lot. And I think there is a groundswell of real commitment to move forward with this sustainable transformation.
So thank you for that. Howard, you're a CEO of one of Canada's larger companies. How do you see your role as a corporate citizen to helping the economy along. Do you agree with Jaqi raised a number of issues that could lead to better inclusion of women, of equity-seeking groups and the like? How do you see the role? Is there a responsibility for the private sector to be able to meet that need?
Well, I believe the private sector cannot afford to not meet that responsibility. All talent is important. Think about it. You know, there's a shortage of talent, and just the idea that we would deny ourselves the opportunity to compete globally by not utilizing the talent that's available to us and is so excellent in terms of its performance doesn't make sense. And so the question is, you know, what should the private sector do? And particularly as we are transitioning to different economies. And I think, you know, we have to send signals. We have to send the right signals. So, for example, the the comment made today, you'll hear often is that, oh, there are lots of jobs, but the skills don't match, right? And that's because obviously we in the private sector are not sending the right signals to the education institutions, for example. Let's take, for example, just in terms of the those who are in STEM, for example, even within our community, maybe 5% totally in STEM, for example. But the world is evolving to more than just engineering now, right? If you look at the AI, how do we prepare, for example, the workforce, male, female, right, to adapt and to prepare themselves to take on the challenges that the new economy will present. So business must send that signal early in the game. And remember, that signal has to go even to the pre-university level, right? To the age 7 to 15, where you have to uh, encourage policy to invest in education to be able to prepare the next generation of workers to be able to meet the requirements that they will face in 10 years. So we do have that responsibility, and there's a lot more that we should do, and we should be a voice. I mean, we don't need to be the Paul Revere that's writing at midnight saying, you know, the British are coming, but we have a responsibility to sound the alarm in terms of where we're going, and the partners and the collaborators will need to help us to get there. And also we have to invest, of course, in R&D in a very strong way, but not just R&D, RD&D. We have to be able to deploy in Canada. That means we have to put resources in so that, for example, our inventions do not go across the border or go somewhere else because there's capital available. And that's the role that government has to play too. I'll just pause here, but there's so much that needs to be done. But we have to send the right signals, and we have to ensure that, for example, and that's all part of SDG and ESG, right? So, right, SDGs, the goals that came out of UN in 2015, right, for practical purposes, and the governance around it is the ESG, where companies have to try and have methodologies and methods to meet those goals. Yeah, I'll just pause here.
Right on. You know, this is very interesting because you know, as a member of Parliament, who, of course, obviously I represent people, but also I hear from our business leaders in my own community, but also I hear from them across the country in terms of what needs to be done. And what I'm hearing more and more is people wanting to ensure that their companies are better reflective of the diversity and the richness of the diversity that exists in this country, because as I like to think, it makes them more resilient. It makes them able to anticipate, I could say that it makes them able to better anticipate changes that are coming, but I also think it's another way of just avoiding not being caught in a model that just doesn't reflect the fullness of the market. would you, and I guess this is for all three of you, are you looking towards more of, are you keeping an eye on domestic issues? Are you keeping an eye more on international trends? Is it a combination of both that you're trying to incorporate into what your organization does? And let's start with you, Norma, on this round. From a union perspective, are you looking at what's happening internationally and trying to anticipate that, or are you looking at domestically and saying, we need to get ahead of this trend?
Well, from a union perspective, we're looking at both, internationally as well as domestically. For instance,
and what trends would you be looking for in particular, either both internationally and domestically? What trends should the people who are watching us should be looking out for?
Well, we've got to basically look at what's happening globally, because it is a global village, and we all know that governments, and it's not just Canadian governments, but all governments are going to have to increase investments, increase revenue, reduce costs, encourage innovation, support their workforce readiness. Government incentives are going to be needed for purchasing more. Howard talked about electrical vehicles, but how do we get folks to buy the electrical vehicles when currently they're more expensive than our traditional vehicles? So incentives from government. We've also got to invest in infrastructure. We need an extensive grid across the country. Canada has to support. You can't just say electrical vehicles. You've got to plan. And of course, this needs to be done yesterday. So working in tandem internationally and piggybacking on what others are doing and sharing resources, it's going to save us a lot of time, just like we did with the development of the vaccine. It was working collaboratively, domestically, as well as internationally. And this is how we got it done. I mean, it was unheard of to develop vaccines this quickly. I think the trends that we should watch, we believe that in some ways the normal could be better, with good leadership from both business and government, domestically and internationally. The changes we'll see in productivity, in green growth, in medical innovations, and the resiliency, that's going to provide the foundation we need over the long term. So I think, once was one of the major trends is going to be spending. We've got low interest rates now. We need to spend, and we need to reinvigorate the economy. And I think it bodes good, but we also have to develop plans and strategies to get her done, as we would say. And there's very little of that happening. I think other countries like China, they're way ahead of us. We've got to start organizing ourselves and working collaboratively on the domestic front. Otherwise, we're going to be left behind. We're in a mineral-rich country. We have lots of resources. It's the question, how do we use those resources and leverage them and to the maximum benefit of Canadians, and work with our international partners to help with that. But we've got to get going with a plan.
Let me ask Howard the same question. Howard, what international or what trends do you think that we should be paying attention to, either domestically, or internationally, or both?
Well, first of all, Jaqi is a global company, And so we do not separate the domestic trend from the international trend. You know, as a matter of fact, when we develop products, we develop them for a global appetite, per se. We distribute our R&D among multiple nations. We track maybe 2 or 3 solutions at the same time because we have no idea which one may be successful, and we try to remain relevant to our marketplace, per se. Now,
So then looking ahead, what would be those international trends that you think that we should be paying attention to?
oh well, number one, the AI, right? As a matter of fact, and not only AI from an internet perspective, but let's go local for a moment. The very idea that AI will now be part of determination of social services, and in terms of evaluating who may or may not be deserving. That's happening internationally. It will happen locally too. And then when you look at that, what are the implications in terms of biases and privacy? That has been creeping slowly into the environment. And this impacts the whole social issue point of view from an AI point of view. AI with respect to triaging, for example, in healthcare. It almost happened, for example, when we got into when we certainly got into the pandemic situation. Fortunately, Canada's response was fairly good, but there are scary moments. AI, as it goes to obviously cryptocurrency, for example, that we may not take seriously right now, but certainly is out there in the fintech sector. AI as it goes to autonomous vehicles, for example. Here again, these are issues where technology are driving changes. And then how do we prepare our workforce to be able to respond to that new opportunity that comes down the road? And not only that, the impact of technology, again, that where's the advantage? How do we, for example, the clusters, Toronto's AI clusters in Montreal is fantastic, and Vancouver, for example. How do we explore that? And not only that, how do we create solutions that we could market globally? Not just within our borders. And then and most important now, the other aspect too, which is very important, is access to global markets through trade, and that's where federal government plays an important role in terms of trade, actually maintaining access to market. And a good example, for example, is EV and batteries. As an example, simply because battery is such a large part of EV. If there is a domestic law in terms of content, then Canada, from a volume point of view, would have difficulty in having a battery plant here. So these are the challenges, not only in trade but in technology, right? Access to market and talent that is so needed. We have to look at all those things.
Let me quickly get Jaqi in, and then I'm going to have one last question to wrap this up. So Jaqi, technology, AI, are these big trends that you would see? Are there other big international or domestic trends that we would have to take a look at?
Yeah, my thoughts would be very consistent. So first, international and domestic, always inextricable. Energy transition, innovation with respect to technology. I would say transformation of healthcare and sustainable transformation of our workforce, skills-based workforce that includes everyone.
That's pithy, right to the point. Let me ask the last question. We didn't start this, we did recognize at the front end that we're coming up to the end of Black History Month. And we're all, the people on this panel are all Black leaders in their own, who are doing exciting things in their own right in various sectors. When we talk about equality for Black Canadians, what do you think we learned during the pandemic? And what do you, or do you think your sector or the government should be doing to advance the economic status of Black workers in Canada? Who would like to start?
I'll take a
All right,
stab.
Jaqi, you go for this.
Yeah. So COVID ripped the Band-Aid off. I mean, if it wasn't clear of the, what the inequalities, that face Black Canadians, what existed before. COVID certainly shone a very bright shining light, but also shone a bright shining light on our capabilities, our talent, what we bring to the table. So if we look at, what our Black scientists and Black doctors have done to move us forward in the pandemic, if we look at what our business people have done, what our public sector have done, there's so much richness. I'm so proud in terms of the role that we can play. Certainly, I think every organization needs to be very clear about having a workforce that looks like Canada and includes people who have been excluded traditionally. So for our organization, it's an integral part of our inclusion strategy. And we have very clear goals. Our leaders are held accountable. Money is on the line for them if they don't engage the richness of all Canadians, including Black Canadians. The final piece I'll say for corporate Canada, and I'll talk about our organization in particular, is I think there's a responsibility to recognize that we're part of Canada. And so for us, that means funding the great work of Black-led, Black-focused groups that know our community, that know what our people need. So we have been very intentional about where our community dollars go. And in fact, we have a program where we double match every dollar that a member of our staff makes to a racial justice-based organization.
Very good. Norma?
Yes, thanks for that. In the middle of the pandemic last year, the Canadian press had a media interview with some of us advocates, myself, Martin Potvin of the Treasury Board, Chris Alliard of the president of PSAC, Nicholas Marcus Thomas, who's also from PSAC and leads the Black Class Action Suit. So, we advocated for changes to public service staffing processes. And, I'll just mention this staggering stat. Non-advertised appointments, and this is related to Black employees, have dramatically increased to 60% in 2020, compared to 29% of all appointments in 2016. So there is an inherent lack of transparency or fairness when positions are not advertised, and the excessive use of non-advertised processes, it just cannot but add to the exclusion of EE groups, given the demographics and the biases of hiring managers. So, as was said, the pandemic shone a light on what was happening. And I'm loving seeing Stats Canada work on disaggregating the data for our EE groups, because it's not one size fits all, and it's not each chapter, let me say, of the EE group getting the same attention. Once managers in the government hit their quota, then they said everything was fine. But we know many Black employees fell through the cracks, and they're not reflected in senior management positions. So I'm looking forward, and I could say the same thing for Indigenous and other groups where biases in hiring are concerned. So I'm looking.
We're bumping up against the time, and I want to give Howard the last word.
Okay.
Howard.
So we have to work on this together.
Right.
So I'll just take the last word to make a pitch. Black entrepreneurism. How do we support that from a business point of view and from a government point of view? And there've been attempts to it. For example, Black North and the Opportunities Fund. There are two funds that have tried to reach out into community, and that's very important and per se. But also, we need to ensure that if we want the workforce tomorrow to be reflective of Canada today, we have to prepare. We have to make the investment in education, in training, working with unions to be able to bring that around. And I think it doesn't happen by itself, right? We have to take an interest, both as Black leaders, both as corporate Canada, and of course the government. But it means investment in education. And with that, I'll just pass it back to you.
Well, look, thank you very much, Howard Shearer, Jaqi Parchment, Norma Domey. Great leaders, great discussion. I'd like to thank the Pearson Center for putting this together to talk about a really important issue, is the economy, the pandemic, and how we can work together, and what do we need to look at, especially as we try to ensure a more prosperous future for Black Canadians. So with that, I'd like to hand back the microphone, because I know that he has a staff to hook me off the stage, to Andrew Cardoso, our Executive Director of the Pearson Center. Andrew? Oops, now Andrew, we're going to do the famous words. Your mic is on mute. Well, there goes. Well, while we lose him, let me just say to all people who are watching, happy Black History Month. And one of the things which a very wise a Black judge told me, he said, it's great that we celebrate Black History Month, but just remember, for 337 other days of the year, we're still Black. So let's make sure that we continue this work all year round. Andrew?
Thank you, Greg. You can hear me now?
We can hear you now.
I just wanted someone to be able to say you're on mute, because that makes it a legitimate webinar. So let me, before I come back and say thank you, I just want to remind our audience of the next couple of events coming up. On Thursday of this week, we have a session with Lloyd Axworthy on Ukraine. That'll be at 12 noon Eastern time. Over the next month, we've got a couple of sessions, one on pharmacare and one on the growth of the isotope sector in March. And in April, we have our annual conference, which will be 10 webinars over the course of 3 weeks, addressing a number of what we've called new challenges for the Canada we want, which will take place in April. Now, this has been everything we expected and more. I want to thank our panel very much, Jaqi Parchment, Howard Shearer, and Norma Domey. You've done wonderfully in terms of explaining or responding to Greg's questions, and to use his word, pithy. You've left us with a lot of really very clear ideas of what the private sector, what labor, and what government should be doing. So thank you so much for being here today, and thank you for the work you do in the private sector in the labor movement. Greg, thank you for being the MP you are, to be reaching out to people all the time. You're back here, as I said, by popular demand, because you always accept our invitations, and we always treasure what you have to say and the kind of openness you share about what politics should be about. So to all of you, all four of you, thank you very much for your continuing service to Canada in so many great ways. I think we are really lucky as Canadians to have leaders like you. Keep up your good work. Thank you. Now, the only thing I'll say is that the people out there, you can't hear them clapping. So what I'm going to ask you to do is to clap for each other as we tune out. So thanks very much, everyone.
Thank you.